The story begins far from the front lines, far from the trenches that swallowed battalions whole, and far from the oceans where carriers burned against the horizon. It begins in a silent room lit only by a single lamp, deep inside a Tokyo research complex that did not appear on any military map. On its doors were no markings, no unit symbols, no welcoming gestures, only a thickened steel lock that told every visitor that crossing this threshold meant stepping into a realm where science bent toward war. In the summer of 1943, the Japanese High Command was desperate for an advantage powerful enough to shift the course of a war they knew was beginning to tilt heavily toward the Allies. The Pacific was tightening around them like a vice. American submarines cutting supply routes, Allied bombers scaling new altitudes, island airfields falling one by one. Within this pressure, any idea, no matter how improbable, became worthy of consideration. This is where the Earthquake Project was born. Its architect was Professor Masamichi Kurata, a geophysicist whose career before the war had been as quiet as the volcanic strata he studied. He was a man fascinated not by conflict, but by the forces beneath the Earth. Pressures built over centuries, plates grinding in silence, the slow accumulation of tension that could shatter mountains in a single night. His colleagues knew him as a man who preferred long silences and meticulous notes. His eyes, however, held something restless, a deep fascination with nature's buried violence. Kurata's research had never been intended for war. Before 1941, he studied seismic patterns, fault lines, and the strange whisper of earth tremors recorded on primitive sensors. But when the Imperial Army came knocking, asking whether earthquakes could be triggered deliberately, not predicted, not mapped, but caused, he did not refuse. In wartime Japan, a refusal was not a practical option. What the military wanted was staggering in its ambition, a weapon that could fracture American defenses without a single soldier firing a shot. They imagined triggering landslides beneath enemy installations, collapsing runways, sending tidal waves curling into harbors heavy with Allied ships. They wanted a force so terrifyingly natural that no Allied engineer could counter it. Kurata did not promise such miracles, but he did not dismiss the possibility either. And that hint of possibility, the faintest suggestion that the Earth itself could be manipulated, was enough. The project was codenamed Jishin Tokubetsu Kenkyu, the Earthquake Special Research Initiative. Funding poured in, laboratories were cleared, men in black uniforms took control of every entrance and exit. And within that windowless space, Kurata slowly assembled a small team of physicists, geologists, and weapons engineers willing to chase what many whispered was impossible. The first months were spent with maps spread across long tables. Japan's seismic archives were pored over, ruffled by sleepless hands. Every pattern, every tremor, every recorded jolt became a clue. Fault systems were sketched, erased, sketched again. Seismic charges were theorized. Devices meant not to explode outward like traditional bombs, but downward, sending focused energy deep into the ground. Kurata believed that if enough force could be delivered at the right angle, at the right depth, and at the right geological fault, it might be possible to trigger a localized quake. Not a catastrophic nationwide disaster, nothing like a city-leveling cataclysm, but something strategically useful. A base shaken off its foundations, a bunker compromised, an airfield runway buckled like a snapped spine. But belief and execution were worlds apart. The early prototypes were crude cylinders lined with shaped charges and copper cones. Engineers carried them gingerly as if handling live animals. They were designed to be dropped from medium altitude into deeply fractured terrain, the volcanic islands Japan planned to defend at all cost. If the Americans ever landed on those shores, Kurata's devices were to be buried beneath the black soil and detonated at moments of tactical importance. These initial tests took place on a remote volcanic islet south of Kyushu. There, among jagged basalt and winds that carried the scent of sulfur, Kurata watched the first detonation. The explosion sounded muted, swallowed immediately by the porous earth. A tremor followed, nothing more than a shiver, a gentle lurch that made pebbles roll down a nearby ridge. The officers who had arrived expecting spectacle returned to their transport disappointed. But Kurata did not walk away disappointed. He saw something in that shiver, a faint responsiveness in the ground. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. And sometimes, in the infancy of a weapon, not nothing is the most important discovery. Weeks turned into months. The war outside grew darker. Japan was losing bombers, losing ships, losing islands. Every loss tightened the pressure on Kurata's laboratory. "Perfect it faster," he was told. "Give us something the enemy does not expect." As the pressure mounted, Kurata's team worked with an obsession bordering on desperation. They tried new alloys, changed charge shapes, rewired detonation sequences. They studied the depths at which the Earth was most vulnerable, learning that some slopes, especially volcanic soil near fault edges, acted like amplifiers. These were places where the Earth felt thin, as if one firm push might send ripples traveling outward. Yet each failure carved away confidence. Some charges sank too shallowly, others detonated too slowly. Sometimes the only result was a puff of dust. Other times the explosion created nothing but a hollow thud that startled nesting birds. Morale broke on the morning a young engineer named Sato dropped a prototype casing, and it detonated prematurely, sending a shockwave that ripped open his torso. Kurata arrived minutes later to find the soil stained dark and the surviving engineers staring in silence. For a long time, the professor did not speak. He merely knelt, touched the twisted metal fragments, and walked back to the lab without a word. After Sato's death, the room grew quieter, the men more careful, every breath measured. The war outside raged louder than ever, but inside the research complex, the world narrowed to wires, pressure gauges, and fault line diagrams. One night, nearing winter, Kurata stood alone over a table of seismic tracings. He noticed something subtle. Many of the most violent tremors in the Pacific were not caused by large shifts, but by rapid ones, sudden, concentrated releases of pressure. That, he realized, was the missing key. The bomb did not need to be bigger. It needed to be faster, a pulse, not a push. He spent the next days sketching what he called a stratopulse initiator, a mechanism that would direct the blast into a single downward jolt. The metaphor that formed in his mind was simple: a hammer striking a chisel. Too soft a strike, and the stone resists. But with a sharp enough blow, the stone splits clean. The new design required precision machining and new materials. But when the prototype was ready, Kurata felt something he had not felt in months: the faint stirrings of hope. The second test took place on the same remote island. This time the charge was buried deeper, angled more carefully, primed for the new pulse ignition. As the wind scraped across the volcanic rock, Kurata stepped back and folded his hands behind him. The explosion came not as a rumble, but as a sudden crack, sharp, instantaneous. The mountain slope several hundred meters away shivered visibly. A moment later, a thin ribbon of dust lifted from its crest and drifted downward. The tremor lasted barely a second, but it was undeniable. Kurata closed his eyes. He had felt it in the soles of his shoes. The military observers were more impressed than before, though still cautious. But headquarters, desperate for anything that promised an unconventional defensive capability, declared the test a success. Production was ordered. Installation diagrams were drafted for the volcanic islands still under Japanese control. Kurata was both relieved and frightened. His weapon worked, not perfectly, not predictably, but undeniably. Yet he also knew the cost, the unpredictability of the Earth, the possibility that a miscalculation could devastate Japanese defenders as easily as it might disrupt an American assault. Still, the order stood. As winter crept over the Pacific and the Americans prepared their island-hopping advance, Japan began quietly burying Kurata's devices along strategic slopes, near bunkers, and beside the fragile seams of volcanic cliffs. They were stored within cave mouths, carried in crates by soldiers who whispered rumors of a weapon capable of turning the land itself into an ally. Kurata returned to Tokyo only once before the project shifted fully into military hands. When he arrived, the city was already dimmed by blackout curtains, the rumble of distant air raid sirens drifting through the streets like warnings from another world. He stepped back into his laboratory where new orders awaited him, improvements, refinements, and demands for a larger device capable of deeper seismic penetration. But something had changed in him. He knew he had touched a force older than war, older than nations. He had awakened it, nudged it, provoked it, and now the war expected him to push even harder. That night he remained in the lab long after the others left. The lamp's glow trembled over maps and notebooks. Dust swirled near the floorboards. He stared at the blueprints for the expanded model, a device heavier than any bomber could realistically deliver, a weapon that demanded more from the Earth than the Earth might be willing to give. He felt dread, not pride. Outside, winter wind rattled the shutters like impatient fingers. Kurata wondered what line he was inching toward, and what might wait on the other side. He wondered whether the Earth itself might someday answer back. And he wondered whether his weapon would shape the future of the war, or bury it. He closed his notebook gently, almost reverently, as if afraid of waking something sleeping beneath the pages. With that small motion, the room fell silent again. And the next chapter of the Earthquake Project was about to begin.